Welcome to the IDPro Show, the best hub for hearing about how to grow your career in digital identity. I'm Heather Flanagan, Executive Director of IDPro and Principal Editor for the IDPro Body of Knowledge.
And I'm Chris Cochran of AKA Identity, and we're here to introduce you to the world of experts and insights and in-depth discussions in identity. Whether you're a seasoned pro or just starting out your journey in digital identity, this is your gateway to the latest trends, knowledge, and career advice.
So we're here today to talk with Mary McKee, Vice President of Engineering at Cirrus Identity. Now, Mary specializes in maturing programs and solutions for identity management, cybersecurity, software development, and especially where those things intersect. She works on IAM solutions enabling business collaborations for education, research, and enterprise organizations. And before that, Mary was a powerhouse at Duke University in their identity and security teams, and I've known her for nearly 2 decades. So welcome, Mary.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me.
All right. So we have to talk about your article. I really enjoyed reading it because people get hung up on rule-based access controls. And that's one of the things you learn when you're in school, when you're taking your first certifications. So where did this policy-based access control article come from? What inspired you to write it?
Yeah, well, I think it started, there was a session that Heather hosted that I joined on. I think it was a similar conversation where I had a little bit of a moment on a panel talking about how, role-based access control is very popular and it's very intuitive and people love it, but it's also often kind of postured as like the gold standard for authorization, which I think is a little bit of an overstatement. So we got to talking about that. And I said, I talk to people about this and making authorization scalable all day long. I would love to just kind of get that down on paper. And I'm really glad that IDPro gave me the opportunity to do that.
Yep. We're using acronyms left and right. We've got policy-based access control. We've got role-based access control. I'm sure we're going to touch on attribute-based access control. And it all kind of swirls in my head. And I get that organizations often start in one place. I think it's usually with RBAC. And then, if they're smart, they transition to PBAC. But in doing that, what are the most common challenges you think they face when making that transition? And what should they be thinking about to mitigate it?
Yeah, I think that's a good, a really great question. And I think a lot of times it's difficult because we tend to think about access control as, let's make sure that we get this person, I have to get this person access to this resource. And so it's very easy to take a person-centric approach. Is, who's the person and how do I get them access to the resources that they need? And any good access control system will allow you to figure out simple questions like, who are the people I have and what do they have access to? Mm-hmm. But if you are in a more complex authorization landscape, it's going to be very difficult to get good governance around people because people are really intersectional. They have different roles, they change responsibilities. And you're not really setting yourself up for success if you have an authorization system that does not facilitate governance. Like, there's, other good IDPro articles about governance, so I won't get too far into that. But where you can usually get good governance is at the resource level, because there's always a tension in authorizations between we have this thing that is a resource that we need to protect. We need to make sure that the right people are in and the wrong people are not in. And so kind of flipping things around and saying, let's make sure that we look at what we can do governance around. Like, here's the thing. How do we define who should be able to get into it under what circumstances? And that's really what PBAC aims to solve. So I guess, Heather, to your question, what are the things you should be thinking about? I would say you should be thinking about how do we set this up so that it's something that over time we can maintain. And it's okay that people come in and they wear different hats in our organization and they switch all over. We don't have to have an authority on every single person in the organization. We just need to have a system that supports authorities for many different resources in a common environment.
I mean, it seems like it could be a pretty heavy lift, but it seems like a lot of work on the front end to make it a lot easier moving forward. So when you think of, and one of the things you talked about was reusability. So reusability in the context of the policies themselves. What should people be thinking about when it comes to reusability and PBAC?
Yeah, so I think reusability is, there's always a sense of how do you define groups of people, any sort of like role or rule-based access paradigm that means to take like I think maybe to take a step back, we know that access control is something that changes all the time, right? You've got people who come into organizations, they leave organizations, they change their relationships to organizations. And we also know that a lot of times the organizational needs change, threat vectors change, things that we have to respond to change. And so I think it really comes down to nobody can solve the whole problem. So how can you make it so that the incentives are aligned such that people can look at their part? We're not going to win if you need to have somebody who understands every single person in the organization and every single resource in the organization. So I think, Chris, to the idea of sort of breaking it down and making it modular, I mentioned earlier, I think it makes a lot of sense to have sort of a resource-based paradigm. But even people who have governance around the resource, they need help from people who know about the people in some reusable ways to kind of segment people, to say, we don't want to say necessarily that the people who are experts in your HR system are going to be able to make balanced decisions about which access, what are the security ramifications of letting them onto the VPN. Let the VPN people, let the security people worry about that. But the HR professionals have a really important part of that puzzle as well, because they can help you say, this is the way that you define full-time staff. Did you think about the fact that we have remote staff? Did you think about the fact that we have a site somewhere else? And so kind of breaking it down to say, let's make sure that each person has an interest in finding that balance of, this is a faithful representation of the threat landscape, of the resource need. This is a faithful representation of how our population breaks down, and how can we meet in the middle so that we can connect the right people to the right thing, which is the shared goal.
I love it. I can tell you spent a lot of time thinking about this.
I'm obsessed with authorization.
Oh, that's great. One thing I think about is scalability. It's one of my favorite topics in the entire world. But when you think about scalability from an IT perspective, when you think about it from a security perspective, the physics of it changes whether you go from a small company to enterprise. Like they're very, very different worlds. But with PBAC, it seems like it could be applicable to any size organization, small or large. And you actually mentioned that in your article. So tell us a little bit about the success stories or the success factors for being able to apply PBAC to a small organization, just like you would a large organization.
Yeah. Thanks for mentioning that. I think my background, which Heather touched on, prior to getting into identity, I was a software developer for 10 years. And I think that that's an important part of kind of how I come to making things scalable. I think that every authorization landscape requires you to have a bit of a sort of manufacturing mindset of like, how do we keep this business going? How do we like churn out the authorizations as we need to? But you also have, in a lot of authorization situations, a need for an engineering mindset, which is how do we make sure that we are resilient to change? And I think that's one place where smaller organizations can be dynamic in much faster ways, where you have a smaller staff or a smaller population who are trying to do big, big things with limited resources. And when you do that, as you grow, if you're a small organization, it makes a lot of sense that you would say, okay, well, we can't hire a whole new person to take on this task. We need to be shifting these things around. And if you're overly formal, I think about that going back from like how you layer the engineering on top of the manufacturing. If you are manufacturing let's say you're a painter, right? Any painter is not going to go in and say, I got my paint, I got my brush, let me get to work. They're going to say, nope, the proper way to do this is you think about it, you paint it off, you prep the wall, you do that. That is a need that every reasonably mature authorization framework is going to allow you to do that. Mm-hmm. But what if the wall is moving as you're trying to paint it and as you're trying to prep it? What if you are also renovating the house? What if you're growing, you're changing, in all of those places, you need the ability to say, okay, let me make sure that that person who is taking on a new responsibility is getting exactly what they need, but we're not over privileging other people or creating so many permissions in our system that we can't really understand what's going on, because we all know you can't secure something that you can't understand. And so you really
Right.
need to like manage complexity.
Very, very, very cool stuff. Now, one of the things you mentioned earlier is, so Chris said his favorite thing is scalability. My favorite thing is governance, because
Yeah,
I have yet to hear of an identity problem that doesn't actually boil down to governance issues as opposed to technology issues.
agreed.
So that said, what do you think are some of the best practices for ensuring that PBAC policies actually remain audible and governable over time?
Yeah, well, my favorite thing is making governance scalable with technology. So I feel like we're
There you
all
go.
among friends here. I think the way that you solve that kind of goes back to what I was saying about making sure that you are separating concerns effectively so that the security people are thinking about security, the people are thinking about people. And I'll give you an example, Heather. You mentioned the work that I did at Duke. One of the things that we did at Duke to facilitate our PBAC approach was to offer hosted reference groups that helped people understand curated populations that the data owners really were willing to back. And anytime we had someone ask us, hey, we want to give access to this group of people, I would take that to the data owners. And if they said, that's a little complicated, it was off the table. We weren't going to do it. We are only trying to say, here are some really well curated populations that you can reference that are endorsed by the people who know those populations best. So at a time where we had a lot of tracking of like things that we wanted to give alumni, we ended up boiling that down to 3 different reference groups. One reference group was all alumni, which is ambiguous. But then you hear the other 2, which is degree alumni. And when you hear that, you instantly know, okay, not all alumni have degrees from this institution. And the
Mm-hmm.
third group is benefits eligible alumni. All 3 of those, it's very complicated. The people who own alumni data can tell you, they can maintain that. They can say, this is the group, we endorse it, use this definition, which means that alumni get a more consistent experience. And then on the, we're offering services, it's much easier for someone to say, okay, well, are we looking for the definition because we're providing a benefit? Are we looking for something that's related to a degree? Or do we not need to overcomplicate it? And you can choose one of 3 options. And, otherwise, people really don't know what they don't know, right? So you get authorization problems in the gaps where someone says, oh, this person looks like an alum. Well, by what flag? In what database? That's where you really need to make sure that you're managing an environment where the data owners are owning the data, the resource owners are owning the authorizations, and then they can lean on each other to get the job done.
So you're making me think of I've been listening to another podcast, Identity at the Center, and they had a
Mm-hmm.
really great one with Omri Gazit talking about authorization. And there's a whole effort to externalize authorization in the same way that, we figured out years ago how to externalize authentication.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I've always wondered how on earth that would work, because I think back to the higher education problems of, okay, yes, alumni, but alumni defined in what manner? Because every school is going to define student, faculty,
Right,
staff, alumni entirely differently. So how this
right.
is supposed to, thinking to the big industry as we're all really lighting authorization on fire, how will that practically work? It's something I struggle with.
Yeah, well, I have some thoughts about that, which I think leans a little bit more on my security background, which is about, the most secure way to manage resources is to not ever do any business with technology. And that is not what we're hired to advise people
Yeah.
to do. So everything is sort of a decision about what advances your risk posture, what gets you the most
Mm-hmm.
benefit, but gives you the least, the least challenges. And I think when you're talking about externalizing authorization, so you say, I'm going to trust this group to give me an attribute or give me a claim or give me something that says that they should be authorized. Um, Generally, the situations that I find where that's the most effective is one where the person who is giving that attribute or claim or policy is someone who has much better firsthand knowledge of that person. So it's like if I am saying, well, I have a guest user from another organization, but I don't want to trust them. I'm going to hold on to all that information. How do I know that their employer didn't have them walked out the door that day in handcuffs? How do I know that they're not about to come to me next? And that is a risk posture decision, right? I have to make the decision about, do I trust that the primary organization or the primary identity provider has a better idea of who that person is, and I'm willing to trade a little bit of control in exchange for a little bit more rapid response, things like that. So I think that's an example of where that kind of federated model can be really powerful, but like anything with identity management, it's a case by case basis.
I love it. I can tell, obviously, you're passionate about security, you're passionate about technology, governance, scalability. One of the things that I love to ask people is, what is that superpower that you've developed over the years? Whether you had it as a child and it kind of just bled into your career, or is it something you didn't realize you had until your career? So, for instance, one of my superpowers is being able to take something from a dream, an idea, a story, and bring it to reality, bring it to a screen or bring it to a page, whatever it is, to create something new. What would you say is your superpower when it comes to you or even your career?
Wow, that's a great question, Chris. The first thing that comes to mind is that I have a lot of interest in this. And I think I really fell in love with identity, I think, in a way that's very related to how I fell in love with gaming at an early age.
Mm.
And I think the hallmark of an amazing game, a really great game, is something that is dead simple to learn and nigh impossible to master. Something that you can pick up. Identity is so much like that. The asking someone simple prompts like, how do you get this person access? Or what does this person have access to? Or, who has access to this system? On the face, those are really simple questions. And they're questions that you can spend a whole career trying to perfect and get better at over time. And so I think interest would be the first thing, is that I just find that so interesting, especially since, it's really easy to make identity work 99% of the time. But if your identity only works 99% of the time, you don't have a functional system. So really kind of pulling back the layers and watching as, new things come up, technologies change. That's been really great. And then the other thing I would say is, I think I'm a pretty empathetic person. And we talked a little bit about governance and making governance scalable. And so much of making governance scalable is making sure that you are aligning the incentives with the liability, right? And so just kind of understanding, you don't want to make it so that somebody has a choice of, can I make this customer happy by giving them access, but there's no repercussions for me of them doing something bad with that access, right? Or do I make this person responsible for something that happens in their system, but I'm not going to give them any latitude to manage who's in and who's out of their system? How do you kind of think about all the parties involved and make sure that we all have a shared and balanced interest in managing that tension between access and security?
I love it. Perfect. One of the things I got to ask you, obviously, because Heather has known you for 20 years, she knew you when you were an intern. What piece of advice or word of wisdom would you have for someone looking to come into identity, whether they're coming from the IT side of the house, whether they're coming from security, or even completely outside of technology altogether? What is that one piece of advice that you would have for somebody out there?
Oh gosh, Chris, I think you just touched on it by asking me essentially, what is my special sauce? I
Yeah.
think that in your early career, regardless, whether it's identity or something else, the thing that makes you feel different is the thing that is your superpower, right? The thing where, you feel like, oh, everybody else looks at it this way and I'm over here being weird and different. That's the thing that you have to channel. And I think I love both identity and security in that I think that they're both really great places where people from diverse backgrounds can get in, and there's so much work to be done that everyone can contribute something. But I think the important thing is making sure that what you're contributing is something that kind of plays to your special sauce, instead of trying to do it the way that everybody else tells you should do it.
Love it.
So we've gotten all this really cool what's happened in the past and how it's molded you to today and what's important today for policy-based access control. You realize this means it's now time to talk about the future.
Oh yeah, let's do it.
So looking into your crystal ball, how do you foresee policy-based access control evolving with advancements in AI and machine learning? in the context of access management?
Oh, that's very interesting. Well, I think in general, any rule based, and by rule based, I mean role based access control, policy based access, any of these that kind of express something, essentially all of those are some sort of domain specific language or like a DSL. And when you have a domain specific language for saying like this entity has this action on this, resource with these limitations, that makes it eminently very consumable for AI to look at. And I expect that we'll be seeing a lot there in terms of anomaly detection, kind of looking for novelty in terms of like what patterns are we seeing that are interesting. I will say though that something that's very important to me that I think is lost about policy based access control in general is that it makes a lot of the AI plays we talk about irrelevant. Well done policy based access control is a definition of the criteria for getting or retaining access, which makes it eminently automatable, right? You're in or you're out. You're still in, or now you're double in, but you're still in, or you've lost all the possible eligibility criteria for you to retain that access, and now you no longer have that access. And I think a lot of when we talk about what could AI do in the authorization space, we're talking about how do we automate things. But I really think that policy-based access control inherently makes it very easy to automate those kinds of things about making sure that people lose access when they no longer should have access, making sure you know why people have access. And so in that way, I think probably where AI would most apply to PBAC would be around like anomaly detection or just making observations about, we noticed that people like this. Here are some things that tie these people together besides your population reference groups, right? So that's what I would expect in that space.
I wonder if it would also be better at, I remember seeing, various and sundry reports and whatnot, trying to explain to, for example, senior management, how and why people had access to things. And they like very rarely actually were able to parse it. And I wonder if AI, it's not just about learning how the decisions are made, but learning how to express that such that management types have a better chance of grasping what's going on and why it's important.
Mm-hmm. I think that's possible. I also think like when I think about AI in the future, I'm mostly orienting to more like generative AI and less to like machine learning, which I think is like what we used to call AI. And there was a lot we did at Duke with machine learning to try to figure out like what are the common things that result in this access so that we can try to automate these decisions. Like how can we just kind of throw it all out there and see what performs the best? And I think that all of those things are helpful, but I really do believe that at its core, I really am about a minimalist approach to identity. And I think that policy-based access control is one way that you can be very clear about how do you define the criteria for being in. If you're thinking about changing those criteria, how do you support yourself with understanding what's going to change? And you kind of check your assumptions with that. Like, oh, I didn't realize that Chris and Heather were going to lose their access if we made that change. Those are the kinds of things that if you're thoughtful up front when you construct your policies, you're able to kind of do in the back end. So where AI takes us from there, I think remains to be seen, but it'll be interesting.
I love it. I love your expertise in PBAC. I love the way you're thinking about the future. Thank you so much for taking the time out of your busy schedule to hop on the mics with us. Thank you, as always, to AK Identity and IDPro for allowing Heather and I to do this exploration of identity and the great folks in the identity space. And importantly, thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule out there in the world, wherever you are, to watch this and enjoy some of the content that we are bringing to the community. And with that, we will see everyone next time.
Thanks so much.